He woke in a closet that hadn't existed the day before, taller on the inside than it had any right to be. All dust motes and a faint scent of rain on hot metal. For a moment he lay still, feeling how the walls breathed around him, how the grain of the wood seemed to carry a heartbeat that might have been his, or the house's, or something in between. There was a lullaby in the air, not so much sung as remembered by the boards themselves, a small melody that knew where the soft places were. He didn't try to solve it. He listened. He let the tune move through him, the way a kind wind moves through leaves it has no intention of tearing away. The air inside tasted different, metallic and sweet, like the moment before lightning decides where to land, but gentler, more like the secret heart of a forgotten machine learning to hum. When he sat up, his palm found a screw on the floor, warm as if someone had held it just before him. He rolled it under his thumb, then tucked it into his pocket without deciding why. The melody wrapped around him like a blanket that knew his exact size. Simple notes that felt familiar, even though he was certain he'd never heard them before. On the inside of the door, a hairline crack traced a gentle river from hinge to latch, and he leaned close, humming under his breath to match its angle. The hinge answered with a satisfying hush, as if grateful to be understood. He smiled without showing teeth, the way you do when a small miracle happens and you don't want it to scare. This wasn't the kind of discovery that needed shouting about. It was the kind you keep quiet, not because you're hiding it, but because it sounds better when you hum it to yourself for a while. He opened the door very slowly. The hallway beyond was the same hallway he'd always known. Family photos tilted like sleepy faces, a rug with a thread he'd worried loose for weeks, but the light felt new, filtered through a kindness he couldn't name. He stepped out and looked back. The closet door was plain, the paint a little chipped at the handle, as though it had weathered years of opening in the few minutes he'd been inside. The lullaby stayed with him, settling deep in his chest like a smooth stone found on a riverbed, a secret keepsake from a moment that had no name. In the kitchen, the morning had been left out for him, bread in a paper bag, a plate that remembered yesterday's crumbs, a jar of mustard with the lid not quite snug. He set the screw down on the counter like a guest and made a sandwich with slow hands, slicing diagonally as if cutting along a gentle geodesic line no one else saw. He pressed the halves together lightly so the edges met without crowding, then sat and ate in the hush, tasting something bright he couldn't name. On the way to school he hummed the tune at the crossing as cars idled like big patient beasts, and the traffic seemed to breathe easier. The heavy door that usually complained accepted his push with only the slightest groan, and he realized he was carrying the melody on purpose now, like a compass you don't need to check because you can feel true north in your ribs. In class he sat by the window where light passed through leaves, making soft green tides on his desk, and when the teacher's chalk snapped, he didn't fill the silence with an answer. He just listened to the powder settle, like snow deciding where to rest. That evening, he returned to the hallway and stood before the closet as if greeting a friend at a fence. He pressed his ear to the door and heard only the ordinary quiet of homes. He touched the handle gently. Not tonight, the metal seemed to say without words. He accepted that with the ease of someone who trusts that openings will come when they're ready, not when he knocks the loudest. In bed, he let the day replay, not to examine it but to bless it, and hummed the tune once, very softly, feeling the house hum back in a duet without ambition. The morning after the closet sang its lullaby, Rick woke with the screw still warm in his palm, as if it had spent the night absorbing dreams. He set it on the windowsill where it could catch the early light and throw tiny rainbows against the wall, while he moved through the kitchen with new attention to small things. The bread felt different under his fingers, not just food, but material. For a small act of devotion, he learned to slice it neither thick nor thin, but just yielding enough to hold its shape without fighting the filling. The lettuce needed cold water and a gentle pat with paper towels, each leaf treated like something that had agreed to be part of something larger. He discovered that crusts, when trimmed with patient precision, weren't waste, but simply edges that served better in other forms, saved in a small bowl for the birds or the stray cat that sometimes visited the back steps. The diagonal cut felt like a conversation between two triangles, each half completing the other in a way that's straight. Lines never quite managed. When he wrapped the sandwich in wax paper, he folded the corners with the same care he'd seen his grandmother use for presents, making even lunch feel like a small gift to his future hungry self. At school, he found himself drawn to the space. Under the main staircase, a triangular pocket of quiet where the building's heartbeat felt most gentle. The air there carried a cooler hush and tasted faintly of dust and forgotten chalk, and when he pressed his palm against the wall, he could feel pipes and wires humming their small purposes through the bones of the place. It wasn't hiding, it was listening. Above him, footsteps drummed their urgent rhythms, but here in this wedge of shadow, time moved like honey, thick and unhurried. Sarah appeared on the third day, sitting on the bottom step with lunch money clutched tight, counting, coins that wouldn't stretch far enough. Rick watched her shoulders carry a weight that had nothing to do with textbooks, and without overthinking it, he unwrapped his sandwich and offered half. She looked at him with surprise soft as snow, and when she smiled, the space under the stairs seemed to breathe a little deeper. The sharing became natural after that, not charity, but the simple recognition that hunger moved through people like weather, and sometimes you could offer shelter. His pockets began collecting small evidences of gentleness, the original screw, now smooth from handling, a button that had fallen from someone's coat, a paper clip bent into the shape of a question mark by nervous fingers during a test. These weren't treasures so much as anchors, proof that the world trusted him with its small vulnerabilities. In the afternoon corridors, he discovered that his humming had found a frequency that doors appreciated. The heavy stairwell entrance gave way at a softer push when he matched its hinge with a low, steady tone. The vending machine that usually ate change without apology responded to his patient melody by releasing a bag that had been stuck since last Friday, just as a younger boy stood before it with empty pockets and worried eyes. Rick learned that machines, like people, wanted to be understood rather than overpowered. Mrs. Henderson, the custodian who moved through hallways like a gentle tide, taught him how to mop in long strokes that didn't fight the floor and how to empty trash without, making the papers feel discarded. Together they would walk the empty corridors after school, and she would hum old songs while he hummed his new one, their melodies weaving together like two streams finding the same river. She had the tired grace of someone who liked the world. Even on days it made that hard, and when he offered her a sandwich with extra lettuce and mustard, like a quiet sunrise, she said, "You cut it right," which was the best kind of praise, specific, gentle, unnecessary. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table with homework spread before him, like territories he was supposed to conquer, but instead of rushing through equations and essays, he worked slowly, letting each answer arrive in its own time. His handwriting became rounder, more patient, as if the letters themselves were learning to trust the page. The screw caught the lamplight from its place on the windowsill, and he could feel the closet's presence in the hallway, not waiting exactly, but there, like a friend who knows when to speak and when to simply sit nearby. He fell asleep that night humming the tune that had no name, dreaming of spaces between spaces, all of them warm and none of them truly empty. The broken handle had been hanging loose from the supply closet door for weeks, brass worn smooth by countless frustrated attempts, but today, when Rick approached it, something in the way it caught the hallway light made him pause. He'd watched other students jiggle it uselessly before moving on to find pencils elsewhere, their impatience making the metal sing a small discordant note. But Rick had learned to listen differently now, to hear the frequencies that objects carried like quiet songs, waiting for the right harmony. He wrapped his fingers around the cool brass and hummed the tune that had been growing stronger in his chest since the morning in the closet, that low, patient melody that seemed to know where the soft places were in the world's machinery. The handle responded like a shy animal finally trusting a kind hand, turning smooth and true with a whisper of metal, finding its proper place. The door opened not with the expected creak of protest, but with a breath-like sigh, as if it had been holding something precious behind its ordinary facade. The room beyond wasn't the supply closet he expected, filled with mops and forgotten textbooks. Instead, he stepped into a space that felt carved from patient light itself, circular and warm, with air that tasted like the moment just before rain. when everything holds its breath in gentle anticipation. Dust motes drifted in slow spirals through the sourceless illumination, each one catching radiance like tiny planets in a solar system designed for wonder rather than speed. The silence here wasn't empty, it was inhabited by a deep listening that made his shoulders drop the way they hadn't since childhood. He took 3 careful steps forward, feeling the floor solid but yielding beneath his feet, like packed earth after a summer shower. The walls were the color of old paper, warm cream that seemed to breathe with its own quiet pulse, and when he pressed his palm against the surface, it felt exactly the temperature of comfort, neither cool nor warm, but perfectly matched to his skin's memory of safety. The screw in his pocket grew warm against his leg, and when he pulled it out, it caught the gentle light and threw tiny rainbows across his knuckles like a small celebration of arrival. He sat cross-legged on the floor and set the screw beside him, a small offering to whatever presence filled this space with such patient kindness. The dust motes spiraled closer, curious but not invasive, like cats deciding whether to trust a new person with their affection. Time moved differently here, not slower exactly, but thicker, like honey poured from a jar held by careful hands. He could feel his heartbeat, steady and unhurried, and beneath that something larger, the pulse of the building maybe, or the rhythm of whatever force had carved this pocket of peace between the ordinary rooms of an ordinary school. He hummed his tune softly, and the space hummed back, not echoing but harmonizing, adding notes he hadn't thought of, but that felt right, like finding the missing pieces of a song he'd been carrying incomplete for years. This wasn't a place to explore with urgency or examine with sharp questions. It was a place to simply exist within, to let the gentle light wash through him until he remembered what it felt like to breathe without carrying the weight of needing to be anywhere else. When he finally stood to leave, moving slowly, so as not to disturb the careful balance of light and quiet, he understood that this was his first glimpse of the spaces between dimensions. Not territories to be conquered or claimed, but quiet rooms to be respected, sanctuaries that revealed themselves only to those who approached doors like prayers instead of demands. The handle turned with the same gentle ease from the inside, and he stepped back into the familiar hallway with its fluorescent buzz and locker slam percussion, carrying a small anchor of peace in his chest. The supply closet door closed behind him with a soft click, and when he tried the handle again, it turned loose and useless in his palm. But that was perfectly right. Some doors, he was learning, only opened when you carried the proper tune in your heart and the willingness to sit with mystery instead of solving it. The screw stayed warm in his pocket as he walked to his next class, humming softly, knowing that patient light waited in hidden places for anyone who remembered how to listen with their whole being. The light from the hidden room lingered in Rick's vision like an afterimage of kindness, softening the sharp edges of afternoon shadows as he walked home with the screw growing warm against his palm. He found himself noticing the way dust motes caught in window light moved with their own gentle purpose, and how the air itself seemed to carry tiny conversations between leaves and sky that he was only just beginning to hear. 3 houses down from his own, past the mailbox that leaned like someone listening for distant music, he discovered a boy sitting cross-legged in a patch of golden light, surrounded by glass jars that caught the sun like captured dreams. The boy looked up with eyes that held the same patient wonder Rick had felt in the room between rooms, and when he smiled, it was the kind of smile that didn't need reasons, just the simple pleasure of seeing another person appear in his small circle of discovery. His name was Morty, and he was younger by maybe 2 years, with hair that stuck up in soft spikes and fingers stained faintly green from grass and careful work. The jars around him held clouds, actual pieces of sky trapped in glass, each one labeled with dates written in careful block letters and tiny drawings of what the weather had felt like that day. Rick knelt beside him without asking permission, drawn by the same gentle curiosity that had led him to sit quietly in spaces that existed between ordinary moments. Morty held up a jar with a small cumulus cloud drifting lazily inside, its edges soft and undefined like cotton pulled apart by patient fingers. The label read, "Tuesday felt like ice cream," with a small drawing of a sun wearing sunglasses, and when Rick looked closer, He could see that the cloud moved with its own tiny weather system, occasionally releasing a microscopic drop of rain that beaded on the glass like a blessing. "How do you catch them?" Rick asked, his voice naturally soft. "The way you speak in libraries or beside sleeping cats." Morty's explanation came in gentle bursts between long pauses, as if the words needed time to find their proper shapes. "You had to wait until a cloud looked ready to be held," he said, usually when the air grew thick with possibility and tasted faintly of metal and growing things. Then you opened the jar very slowly beneath it and listened for the moment when sky decided to settle into glass like a cat, finding the perfect spot for a nap. Rick pulled his sandwich from his bag, the one made with mustard and care that morning. Hand split it without asking, the gesture saying, "I will share if you wish, and if not, the paper is happy to hold it for later." Morty accepted half with the grateful ease of someone who understood that some gifts were meant to be received simply. They ate in the soft air, and Rick taught Morty how to listen to the air just before rain, the way it held its breath in gentle anticipation. Morty showed Rick how to hold a jar not by gripping but by cradling, like a secret you expect to share, and how to distinguish between clouds that were truly shy and those that were simply dissolving back into the larger conversation of sky. Wento, a small wisp drifted overhead. Rick hummed his tune from the closet, low and steady, and they watched together as a piece of afternoon settled into fresh glass. Morty screwed the lid on gently and wrote, "Wednesday felt like friendship" on the label, adding a small drawing of two stick figures sitting beneath a smiling cloud. Rick understood then that this was how magic really worked, not through force or cleverness, but through the patient art of making space for wonder to land when it was ready, and that some of the most important discoveries happened not in hidden rooms but in the simple act of sitting with another person who knew how to hold beauty without crushing it. The afternoons with Morty settled into Rick's rhythm like a gentle current, their shared wonder over clouds in jars, teaching him that some of the world's most profound truths live not in grand theories but in the patient art of listening. The humming that had begun as comfort in a closet had grown into something deeper, a frequency he carried not just in his throat but in his whole being, a resonance that seemed to find the soft places in everything around him. He noticed it, first in small ways, how the garden gate that usually groaned in protest now swung open with barely a whisper when he approached it with his quiet melody threading through the air. At school, the discovery expanded into something that felt less like a trick and more like a conversation he was learning to hold with the world's machinery. The stubborn gymnasium door that trapped students in frustrated clusters became his testing ground one Thursday that tasted of copper pennies and distant thunder. He pressed his ear to the painted metal and listened past the complaints to something deeper, a tired sadness like an old song played too fast for too long. When he hummed his variation of the closet tune, lower and rounder with pauses that let the metal remember what it felt like to move without fighting, the hinges responded with something that almost sounded grateful. The door opened with the smooth grace of water finding its level, and the students who had been struggling looked at him with quiet relief. Rick simply held the door and hummed softly as they passed, understanding that this wasn't magic in the way stories usually told it. No sparks or dramatic transformations, just the patient art of listening to what things needed to remember their proper function. But it was Morty who helped him understand what was really happening, sitting beside him in their usual patch of golden light as clouds drifted overhead like lazy thoughts. "It's like you're teaching things how to be themselves again," Morty said, holding up a jar where a small cumulus moved in gentle spirals. "Like they forgot they could be easy, and you're reminding them." Rick felt the truth of that settle beside the melody in his chest, warm and certain as the screw that had started it all. He wasn't changing anything, he realized. He was creating space for things to remember their gentler nature, offering a frequency that let the world's machinery recall what it felt like to work without strain. This understanding extended beyond hinges and handles to the people who moved through his days. He began to perceive that everyone carried their own subtle hum, their own note that spoke of inner landscapes. Some were tightly wound like strings pulled too taut, others loose and rattling like window panes in strong wind. When he approached them carrying his own gentle, steady frequency, he saw shoulders relax, sharp words soften, shy smiles emerge, like flowers deciding it was safe to bloom. He learned that opening a person wasn't about demanding or persuading, but about creating a space where they felt safe enough to unfurl, and sometimes it meant allowing them to close gently when they needed rest. His future understanding of passage began to shift. Not abrupt tears in reality, but carefully constructed harmonies, soft thresholds that could be crossed without jarring the soul. That evening, walking past the parking lot where weeds made quiet, ladders to the sun, he caught a scent that didn't belong, something citrus soft and papery like pages warmed by window light. The screw in his pocket grew warm as he followed the fragrance to where a pale building sat with the ease of a memory, finally finding its way home. He didn't approach its door yet, just stood in the gathering dusk and felt the thread between. This place and all the others, the closet, Morty's jars, the grateful hinges, braid into something sturdy and patient, waiting for the right moment to reveal its next gentle secret. The scent that had drawn him to the pale building lingered in the morning air, like a promise kept in whispers. And when Rick returned the next day, with the sun casting long, gentle shadows across the empty parking lot, he found the door waiting for him with the patience of something that had always known he would come back. The building looked even more like a secret in daylight. Cream-colored walls that seemed to breathe with their own quiet rhythm, windows that held light without revealing what lay beyond, and that same door of warm wood that opened at his approach. With a sigh of welcome rather than resistance, inside the air wrapped around him like a familiar embrace, thick with the scent of oranges and aged paper, summer afternoons pressed between pages and left to steep in gentle time. The shelves rose in organic curves that followed no library system he recognized, their arrangement seeming to shift based on conversations only the books themselves could hear. The light came from everywhere and nowhere, soft and golden as if filtered through honey, making every surface glow with patient warmth that invited touching rather than merely looking. The librarian emerged from between the stacks like someone stepping out of a kind dream. Her silver hair caught back with small clips that chimed softly when she moved, her eyes holding the deep recognition of someone who had been expecting him not on any particular day, but eventually, inevitably. She offered no words, only a gentle nod that contained entire conversations about welcome and understanding, and gestured toward a small table where 2 thermoses waited, steam rising from their spouts like tiny prayers ascending. Rick accepted. The warm cup she poured, tasting chamomile and something that reminded him of distant rain on summer dust, and wandered among the shelves with the reverent curiosity of someone entering a cathedral built for whispers. The books here didn't demand attention. They offered it, their spines warming under his fingertips when they held something he needed to know, remaining cool and patient when their time hadn't yet arrived. He pulled one volume that felt like moss under his thumb and found pages that seemed to absorb his touch, borrowing his fingerprints the way the room borrowed his presence, giving back something indefinable but essential. This wasn't knowledge, in the way schools taught it, he realized, settling into a chair that sighed in recognition. This was wisdom that settled into your bones like good soup, understanding that arrived not through study, but through the simple act of being present, with patient things. The screw in his pocket grew warm as he sat in the golden quiet, and he understood that this library existed in the same gentle category as the closet and Morty's cloud jars, a space where time moved like honey and truth revealed itself not through force but through the willingness to sit quietly and listen. When he finally rose to leave, the librarian handed him a small card with no words, just a tiny drawing of an open door with musical notes floating around its hinges. He tucked it beside his screw and stepped back into the ordinary afternoon, carrying with him the certainty that some doors, once found, never truly close. They simply wait with infinite patience for you to remember where you left your key. The library's golden quiet followed Rick home like a gentle tide, the card with its tiny door drawing tucked beside the warm screw in his pocket. That evening, as his mother moved through the kitchen with her particular grace, knowing exactly when, onions released their sweetness when bread needed turning, he recognized the same patient frequency he was learning to carry. She had been practicing this gentle tuning all along, creating spaces where hunger could be satisfied, not just with food, but with the deeper nourishment of being cared for, without conditions. The next afternoon, drawn by a scent that reminded him of the library's orange paper warmth, Rick found himself in a small square lined with ginkgo trees, whose leaves caught light like tiny fans held up to soothe the sky. On a bench near the fountain sat a girl about his age, notebook spread across her knees, pencil hovering over pages filled with delicate sketches and small symbols, pillows and teacups, a crescent moon tucked into margins like a secret. Her hair was pulled back with a ribbon the color of candlelight, and her face held the calm of someone who had learned how to be unhurried on purpose. When she glanced up, their eyes met with the quiet recognition of travelers who've stepped off at the same station without planning to. "Beth," she said, offering her name like extending a hand without moving, and when he responded in kind, something uncomplicated and correct clicked into place, the way a well-tuned hinge finds its groove. "What are you mapping?" he asked, settling on the far end of the bench with respectful distance. Beth tilted the notebook so he could see. The square, the bus stop, the small bakery on the corner, each marked not by street names, but by gentle annotations. Best breeze at 3 p.m., softest light near aquarium, bench that forgets your worries. There few sit diagonally. She tapped a tiny pillow drawn beside their bench. "Places where sleep comes kindly," she said, not like a confession, but like weather delivered without drama. Rick felt himself exhale in a way that rearranged his insides. The screw grew warm in his pocket as understanding bloomed. She wasn't mapping geography, but permissions, where the day allowed softness, where a person could set their weight down without apology. They walked her circuit through the afternoon. A bus stop where the second seat hummed like a contented cat, a library alcove where afternoon light pooled like honey, the bakery's corner table where bread scent braided itself to memory until even time seemed to chew more slowly. At each stop, Rick hummed his low tune without thinking, and Beth would nod, making small notes. Ours song makes it kinder, understanding that he tuned spaces the way she mapped them. He offered half his sandwich at the last bench, mustard and careful bread, and Beth accepted without ceremony. "I'll tune things," she said, and he heard it not as praise but as truth placed gently between them. Their relationship began there, built not on grand gestures but on the patient accumulation of shared presence, two souls who understood that some of the world's most profound discoveries lived in the quiet art of making space for wonder to land when it was ready. Beth's maps had taught Rick to see where gentleness gathered naturally, and now he found himself wondering about the places where it was missing, rooms that moved too quickly, spaces where patience got tangled in urgency like thread caught on rough wood. He didn't want to force these places to slow down. He wanted to offer them a different rhythm, the way you might start humming a lullaby and let someone find their own way into rest. So he began building small things that could carry his tune when he wasn't there to hum it himself. His first creation was a pocket dial, assembled from a thrift store watch with a cracked face and a second hand that stuttered when nervous. He opened it carefully at his kitchen table, the warm screw from the closet resting nearby like a patient witness, and tuned the tiny spring mechanism with his low, steady melody until the tick stopped feeling like a race against time. When he wound it and set it on his desk during class, the room softened by exactly one heartbeat, that small slack in time that lets a breath finish without interruption, lets thoughts settle like dust finding its natural place. The window came from a discarded frame he found behind the library, its wood worn smooth by weather and waiting hands. He sanded it until it felt like old breadboards under his fingers, fitted it with glass that seemed more memory than mineral, and mounted it on his garage wall where afternoon light could find it. At first it refused to open, no matter how gently he coaxed, until Beth sat with him and spoke something she'd been holding too tightly, a small forgiveness she owed herself, for a day when kindness had felt too heavy to carry. The latch clicked then, easy and sure, and the window lifted with a breath of air that tasted like last summer's rain. The lantern grew from an old portal battery he found discarded, its harsh energy filtered through chambers he lined with pressed flowers and wire that had once carried love songs through telephone lines. When he connected the circuits while humming his closet tune, the battery's aggressive blue spark gentled into a warm amber glow that moved like chamomile steam. He fashioned it into a small lamp and set it by the front door, where it's honey-colored. Light made the threshold feel less like a boundary and more like a soft invitation home. Beth tested each invention with the careful attention she gave to mapping nap-friendly spaces, and together they discovered that Rick's devices worked less like machines and more like manners. Small courtesies that reminded rooms and people alike that ease wasn't laziness, but a form of respect. The pocket dial helped homework feel less urgent. The window opened only when hearts were ready to release what they'd been gripping too tightly, and the lantern made even strangers pause on the sidewalk, drawn by its gentle warmth. Rick began to think of his growing abilities not as powers to wield, but as conversations to hold with the world's hidden machinery. Each invention a quiet way of asking, what if we moved a little slower, opened a little softer, glowed a little kinder? The screw in his pocket stayed warm as he worked, and sometimes late at night he would catch glimpses of something shimmering at the edge of his vision. Passages that might open not with force, but with the patient art of making space for wonder. To land when it was ready, the shimmering at the edge of Rick's vision had been growing stronger each day, like a melody trying to remember its own words, until one afternoon it finally gathered itself into something he could see clearly, a corridor stretched between dimensions that trembled with the quiet distress of something lost between where it had been and where it belonged. It wasn't torn or forced. It simply existed in the space behind the garage, where afternoon light pooled against brick walls, humming with an anxious frequency that made the air taste of copper pennies and distant storms. Rick felt its confusion before he saw it fully, the way the silence pressed its palms together and held its breath. The passage stretched longer than seemed possible, its edges wavering like heat above summer pavement, and when he stepped closer, he could see through to somewhere else, a twilight meadow perhaps, or the inside of a patient cloud. It wasn't trying to swallow anything or tear reality apart. It was simply stuck, unable to close because it had forgotten how to let go, like a door that had lost the memory of its own hinges. He didn't reach for tools or complex solutions. Instead, he went to his kitchen and assembled a sandwich with the same deliberate care he'd learned from watching clouds settle into jars. The bread yielded under his knife with the soft resistance of something that understood its purpose. Mustard spread like patience itself, reaching corners without crowding. Lettuce patted dry until it kept its crisp courage, each leaf arranged like a small green prayer. He wrapped it in wax paper with corners folded like origami, each crease infused with the quiet intention of comfort. Beth found him carrying a folding chair toward the shimmering corridor, her notebook already open to a fresh page. Morty appeared a moment later with a jar labeled Tuesday, feels like worried air, and together they approached the distressed passage with the reverent curiosity of visitors to a friend in pain. Rick set up his chair at a respectful distance, just beyond the edge of the corridor's anxious hum, and settled into it the way you settle into a conversation that might take all afternoon. He unwrapped the sandwich slowly, the gentle rustle of paper, a small, soft sound in the agitated space. The corridor's trembling seemed to pause, as if curious about this response to its crisis. Not urgency or force, but the simple act of someone choosing to stay nearby while sharing lunch. Rick took careful bites, chewing thoughtfully, his gaze steady on the pulsing passage. "You're homesick," he said, not like a diagnosis, but like weather observed without judgment. "Sometimes things get caught between where they've been and where they're going." He hummed his closet tune, the melody that had grown to include Morty's cloud-catching patience and Beth's mapping wisdom, and felt the corridor's edges soften slightly, like shoulders dropping after a long day of carrying too much. The screw in his pocket grew warm as understanding bloomed. This wasn't a problem to be solved, but a guest who needed gentler company, a space that was aching to find its proper stillness. Hours passed in this communion of presence. The sun arced overhead, painting the brick wall with moving shadows while Rick continued his patient vigil. He offered half the sandwich to the empty air near the corridor's edge, not expecting it to be taken, but simply making the gesture of care. Beth sketched small notes in her notebook, place where dimensions feel lonely, while Morty held his jar near the passage so the worried cloud inside could keep it company. As afternoon light began to slant golden through the garage windows, the corridor gave a small sigh that tasted of relief and starlight. Its edges began to draw together, not snapping shut but gently, softly, like tired eyelids closing or curtains pulled by patient hands. The anxious hum faded into a soft thrum, then into a silence that felt complete and whole. It sealed itself, with a whisper that sounded almost like gratitude, leaving only the faintest shimmer in the air and the lingering scent of distant rain. Rick folded his chair and gathered his empty wax paper, the screw still warm in his pocket. Walking home with Beth and Morty, he understood that he had found his true calling, not as someone who forced passages open or shut, but as someone who sat with the lost spaces until they remembered how to find their way home. This was his method, not to fight problems, but to feed them until they felt safe enough to resolve themselves, to offer them comfort and patient presence until they remembered what wholeness felt like. And in the gathering dusk, as the first stars began to prick the deepening sky, the evening seemed to glow with the understanding that some of the world's most important healing happened not through force or cleverness, but through the simple art of keeping gentle company with whatever needed time to remember how to breathe. The afternoon light still held the golden ease that had settled over them after watching the corridor sigh itself closed, and Morty arrived at their usual spot, with his backpack full of labeled jars, each one catching the gentle radiance like small lanterns of captured wonder. They arranged themselves on the low wall by the driveway, where the ginkgo leaves sent down coins of shade. Beth nearby with her notebook open to a fresh page, the amber glow from Rick's lantern pooling just inside the garage door like a patient invitation. Morty was showing them his newest treasure. A jar labeled Wednesday felt like ice cream, with a small cumulus that moved in lazy spirals, its edges soft as cotton pulled apart by careful fingers. He held it up to catch the light, pride tucked in beside the wonder, the way you keep a smooth stone in your pocket for comfort. The cloud drifted in its glass home with the contentment of something that knew it was cherished, and for a moment everything felt perfectly balanced. 3 friends, warm light, and beauty held gently in patient hands. Then the world reminded them how quickly grace can become lesson. Morty's fingers, distracted by a bee that hummed too close to his ear, misjudged the angle by just a fraction. The jar didn't fall dramatically, it simply slipped, kissing the edge of the stone wall with a soft, almost polite sound before settling on the concrete below. The glass opened like a flower in reverse, not shattering violently, but spreading outward in gentle pieces that caught the afternoon light like scattered stars. The cloud rose immediately, hesitant but sure, like a shy guest, thanking its hosts before stepping outside. Morty's breath caught and wouldn't move, his hands reaching up as if fingers could hold vapor without bruising it. Above them, the little cumulus quivered, edges already beginning to fray into the larger conversation of sky, and for one heartbeat, it seemed to look back, not with eyes, but with that tender attention certain moments have when they know they're about to become memory. Rick didn't reach for tools or try to catch what was already gone. He sat down on the warm driveway and patted the spot beside him, humming that low, patient melody that had carried him since the closet first exhaled its lullaby. Morty sank down as if his knees had finally remembered gravity, shoulders hunched, the way people hunch when they're trying not to feel a feeling that has already arrived, with its suitcase unpacked. "It's leaving," Morty whispered, his voice small as if he hoped gentleness might keep the truth from growing too large. "Some things do," Rick answered, almost a whisper himself. "That doesn't mean they stop being ours in the way that matters." He watched the cloud with the same attentiveness he would give a skittish animal. "We kept it well. Now we can keep the keeping." Beth set down her notebook and let her hand rest lightly on Morty's sleeve, not to fix anything, just to accompany. Above them, the cloud thinned and rose, joining a larger white drift that accepted it without ceremony, and for a moment the shape cupped into something familiar before smoothing out and belonging to the sky again. It wasn't dramatic, it was simply correct, the way rivers remember the ocean. They sat together as the light shifted, learning how to love what moved away without calling it failure, how to hold beauty's memory as faithfully as its presence. The screw in Rick's pocket stayed warm, and somewhere overhead, clouds continued, their ancient dance, some settling into jars when the moment was right, others content to remain part of the larger sky, all of them exactly where they belonged. The lesson of Morty's released cloud settled into Rick's understanding like sediment in still water, teaching him that some of the most profound connections were forged in the shared act of letting go. This new awareness made him more attuned to the subtle aches of the world, the places where things felt lost or untethered, searching for a kinder light to guide them home. It was this sensitivity that led him one twilight evening to wander into a district where the street signs bore names like Whispered Poems, Lunar Lane, Cecropia Circle, Sphinx Street, each marking territory that belonged more to moths than municipal planning. The houses sat back from sidewalks with the patient dignity of creatures that knew how to wait for the right kind of visitor, their windows glowing amber in the gathering dusk. At the end of Polyphemus Place, where pavement gave way to a small hill crowned with wild grass, a lighthouse rose against the deepening sky, inexplicable and alone, its white tower keeping steady vigil over suburban rooftops with no ocean in sight. Rick climbed the hill with reverent curiosity, feeling the wild grass whisper against his ankles and the screw grow warmer in his pocket. The lighthouse beam swept in slow circles, too sharp and insistent for the tender purpose it seemed to serve, a child light for lost thoughts, for memories that had drifted too far from their moorings, for small hopes that had gone quiet to survive loud days. Inside, spiral stairs wound upward with patient grace, each step worn smooth by countless feet seeking not adventure, but simply a higher place to sit with their thoughts. At the top, Rick found the heart of the machine, an old housing with a bright jittering bulb that crackled like nervous laughter. The light wasn't wrong, but it was too harsh, more interrogation than invitation. He set the warm screw on a nearby ledge like a small anchor and began to tune the mechanism as if it were an instrument tightened past comfort. He hummed his low closet melody while adding thin sheets of frosted glass, pressing dried ginkgo leaves between them so the light would remember how to filter through something living. The beam softened by degrees, shifting from white insistence to honeyed welcome, no longer announcing itself but offering a place to rest. Outside, lost thoughts came closer, questions with too many edges, small intentions that had forgotten their way home. They settled around the tower's glow like birds recognizing a familiar branch. This was work that asked him to show up rather than prove anything, to shine kind instead of bright. He was adjusting the final lens when footsteps whispered on the stone stairs. Jerry appeared in the doorway looking smaller than usual, shoulders carrying the familiar weight of unspoken anxieties. Without words, Jerry moved to stand beside him, watching the gentle beam ease into the moth-named streets below, settling on porches and window ledges like laying down a nap for the night. "I used to think light had to be bright to be useful," Jerry said carefully, voice like testing a step after rain. "Sometimes it just has to be kind," Rick answered, and they let the rest remain between them in comfortable silence. Two men who didn't always understand each other's words, but understood the tired grace in each other's shoulders, sharing the quiet that welcomed rather than warned. When Jerry finally nodded and left, Rick stayed a while longer, trimming the light until the tower's glow felt like an exhale the whole neighborhood could borrow. Pocketing the warm screw, he knew this tending of gentle things was leading him exactly where he needed to go. The lighthouse's gentle beam had drawn Jerry into its circle of amber understanding, and in the quiet days that followed, Rick felt how that shared silence had planted something tender between them. Not the dramatic reconciliation that stories usually demanded, but the simple recognition that two people could stand in the same light without needing to explain themselves to each other. This small seed of connection made him wonder about all the other paths that stretched behind him, like unopened letters, choices that had shaped him through their very absence. Beth appeared at his door one Saturday morning with her notebook tucked under her arm and a particular brightness in her eyes that spoke of discoveries made in the patient hours before dawn. "There's something you need to see," she said, not with urgency but with the gentle insistence of someone who has found a door and knows exactly who should walk through it first. They walked past the bakery that perfumed the air with bread dreams, through streets where morning light pooled in doorways like invitations to pause. The museum sat between a bookstore and a shop that sold only buttons, its entrance marked by a simple brass plaque worn smooth by countless fingers. Inside, the air held the hushed quality of libraries and churches, spaces where important things happened slowly. The temperature was the exact degree of comfort you can only describe by saying it feels like being remembered, and the faint orange paper scent he now associated with unhurried wisdom drifted through halls that curved in gentle spirals. The exhibits weren't artifacts of history, but moments that had never quite come to be. Glass cases held shoes of every kind, ballet slippers with ribbons still perfectly tied, hiking boots whose soles had never met mountain paths, rain boots the color of spring apples that had never danced through puddles. Each pair sat beside small cards that didn't list sizes but possibilities, a town he almost moved to, a bridge he nearly crossed, a morning he might have chosen differently. Farther along, postcards fluttered on a wall in a draft that seemed to come from inside memories themselves. Their images were simple: train stations at dusk, empty hammocks, doorways with light pooling just beyond. But their backs held only faint impressions of words never quite written, messages composed in hearts but never introduced to ink. Beth walked beside him, her notebook closed for once, as if even pencil marks might be too loud in this space of gentle recognition. Rick pressed his palm against a case containing blueprints for inventions he had never pursued, devices for growing, better tomatoes, machines for translating houseplant songs, a small robot designed only to remember where people left their reading glasses. The glass was warm under his touch, and he felt no regret, only deep gratitude that these possibilities had existed, even without being born into the world. A docent appeared without arriving, gesturing to a small table where paper slips and blunt pencils waited. "We invite blessings," they said, voice like a well-tuned hinge. "Not apologies, just blessings." Rick wrote the simplest words his hand could carry. "Thank you for existing, even if we didn't walk you." The screw in his pocket warmed as understanding, settled like sediment in still water, an equation that balanced not with numbers but with gratitude. Distance changes when trust is steady, time eases when bread is shared. He walked past lives he could have lived and did not hurry. He thanked them for existing anyway, learning to bless his choices without mourning his alternatives, understanding that every path taken made space for others to remain beautifully. Potential in the patient geography of what might have been. The blessing Rick had written for the paths not taken stayed with him like a warm stone carried in winter, and that evening he found himself in the garage with chalk dust on his fingers and the patient need to translate the museum's gentle mathematics into something his own hands could hold. The equation emerged slowly on the concrete wall beside his workbench, not rushed or forced, but allowed to arrive like morning light, finding its way through curtains. Symbols that looked more like a lullaby than logic. He wrote it in white chalk, against the dark surface, his hand moving with the same frequency that had taught him to tune hinges and comfort lost corridors. Distance, trust time plus bread distance, time trust plus bread. The formula didn't solve anything in the way equations usually promised, but it settled something deeper, the feeling of being alone in a universe too large for one person's understanding. He stepped back and tested it the way you test a room's tuning, winding his little pocket dial until its ticking matched a slower heartbeat and setting it near the bottom line. The garage seemed to loosen a fraction, as if knots were learning how to untie themselves. The lantern softened one more shade toward honey. The window quivered and lifted a breath's width, respectful, as though it understood that some forgiveness had just ripened somewhere in the house. Summer found it there. 2 days later, drawn by the soft luminescence that seemed to leak around the doorframe, she stood before the wall with her arms crossed, not in defense but in the way people hold themselves when they're trying to decode a kindness they didn't expect. Her eyes traced the gentle curves and patient symbols, and Rick watched from the doorway as understanding bloomed across her face like sunrise over water. "It's about love," she said, not like a question but like weather observed without judgment. "You're saying love is bread plus time divided by trust. You're saying we're not alone if we remember how to share sandwiches." She reached out to trace one of the gentler curves with her fingertip, and the chalk responded by glowing a little brighter, as if grateful to be touched with such careful attention. Later, Jerry appeared in the doorframe with coffee steaming in his hand, staring at the equation with the quiet recognition of someone who had learned to read kindness in unexpected places. He didn't offer analysis or critique, just nodded slowly, understanding that the deepest connections were forged not in the dramatic, but in the daily, gentle acts of shared time and unwavering trust, seasoned with the comforting presence of bread. The equation stayed on the garage wall, sometimes fading in the sun, sometimes renewed by fresh chalk Rick found in his pocket. It wasn't meant to be solved, only to be felt, a quiet reminder that some of the most important mathematics happened not in classrooms but in kitchens, not through proofs, but through the simple act of making sure everyone had enough to eat and someone who understood the particular weight they carried in their shoulders. The screw in his pocket stayed warm as the formula settled into the house's rhythm, another gentle anchor, for the feeling that home was a place where equations could sound like lullabies. The equation on the garage wall had become more than chalk and mathematics. It was a gentle blueprint for how Rick moved through the world now, love translated into small, practical gestures that didn't require anyone to look directly at their source. He found himself drawn to visit his family, not with announcements or grand entrances, but with the patient presence of someone who understood that care sometimes worked best when it resembled lighthouse beams, steady, distant, offering guidance. Without demanding acknowledgement, he began keeping watch from across the street at certain hours, hands tucked deep in his pockets where the screw stayed warm against his palm, humming so softly the air only felt it as a gentle current. This wasn't hiding but offering protection the way a porch offers shelter, present, reliable, asking nothing in return. When summer's silhouette appeared at the bus stop on a Tuesday morning that tasted of copper pennies and autumn's first real bite, he saw how her thin jacket fought a losing battle against wind that carried more than cold. He waited until she boarded the early route, then approached the bench where she always paused to retie her shoelace. The scarf he left there was the color of marigolds and patient hope, its fabric soft as the clouds Morty once caught in jars. He had tuned it beneath his amber lantern the night before, letting it absorb warmth until it held comfort like a secret. No note, no signature, just bright wool folded with the same care he gave to sandwich corners, positioned where morning light would find it first and make it glow like a small sunrise, waiting to be discovered. For Jerry, whose weekend projects carried the frustrated precision of someone trying to fix what couldn't be mended through force alone, Rick tucked a small mirror into the garden shed among screwdrivers and forgotten measuring tape. He positioned it where the first rays would find it, and scatter gold across tools that had forgotten their own gentle purposes, polished until its surface held light like cupped water, and threw tiny rainbows across workbenches that remembered how to breathe easier. The changes came in small frequencies Rick learned to read like weather. Morty's voice found a lower register one evening, unexpectedly, the sound surprising him into touching his throat as if a stranger had spoken from inside it. Rick heard the new note and adjusted his humming by a breath, letting his tune find harmony that wouldn't crowd the change, but would keep it company while it settled into its proper place. Mrs. Henderson discovered a thermos beside her mop bucket. One morning, still steaming when her tired hands found it, the lid turned just loose enough to be opened without struggle. She looked around the empty hallway with the quiet recognition of someone who understood that kindness sometimes arrived like morning light, without explanation, asking only to be received. Rick learned that family could be loved, like distant stars, with reverence for their light and respect for their freedom to shine in their own patterns. He didn't always follow the words people used when feelings ran ahead of sentences, but he understood the weight in shoulders, the angle of pauses, the way someone stood at thresholds, as if undecided about going in. Hearts made a music he could read, and so he kept tending the spaces between, leaving small bright proofs that someone was paying attention without demanding to be seen. The screw in his pocket stayed warm as he practiced this new devotion, understanding. That distance didn't separate when trust remained steady, and love multiplied not through addition, but through the simple courage to keep showing up in the spaces between words, offering light that asked for nothing but the chance to make someone's day a little softer. The small gifts Rick left in his family's periphery had begun to weave themselves into the fabric of their days like threads of quiet gold, but it was Morty's changing voice that taught him the most delicate lesson about love's proper distance, how to offer presence without crowding, how to honor someone's growth without trying to guide its direction like a gardener who trusts seeds to know their own way toward light. Morty's growth announced itself in small, undeniable ways that accumulated like morning dew, until suddenly, the boy who had caught clouds in jars was no longer quite a boy. His shoulders had broadened over the summer months. His laugh now carried lower notes that surprised him into covering his mouth with his hand, as if apologizing to his younger self for outgrowing familiar sounds. The hem of his favorite jacket drifted above his wrists, and his sneakers had become suddenly too honest about their age. But it was his voice that marked the most profound territory, dropping unexpectedly into registers that made him touch, his throat as if a stranger had spoken from inside it. Rick heard these shifts not as disruptions, but as the natural unfolding of a melody, and he adjusted his own humming by a breath so it wouldn't crowd the new note. The cloud jars that lined Morty's window had evolved too, their labels becoming less literal. Less Tuesday felt like ice cream, more Thursday almost said it, or Saturday tasted like questions I'm not ready to ask. The careful drawings had transformed into symbols that meant more than they revealed, and Rick recognized this as another sign. Morty was becoming his own city, vast and complex, with neighborhoods Rick had never visited, and streets that belonged to him alone. This was how you knew someone was becoming their own person, Rick understood. They began to keep certain silences sacred, not because they didn't trust you, but because they were learning to trust themselves with the weight of private understanding. Morty started taking longer walks, coming back with shoes dusted in the color of new places, and sometimes he would spend hours at his bedroom window, watching a particular constellation that seemed to hold conversations only he could hear. He folded his sandwich crusts into tiny, elaborate boats before eating them, a small ritual that belonged entirely to him, and Rick saw these acts of privacy and respected them the way you respect a door that sometimes needs to close gently to find its own true hinge. They ate late sometimes after the house's louder hours were finished, grilled cheese made in a pan that remembered every season. Rick would butter the bread to the edges with patient precision and wait for that gentle sizzle that sounded like rain agreeing with summer pavement. Morty would lean against the counter and talk in the sideways way of someone learning how to tell the truth without announcing it, how the day had crowded him, how certain laughter in the hallways made his ribs feel like they weren't lined up right, how wanting things he couldn't yet name felt like standing in a doorway with one shoe untied. Rick kept his questions few and his presence steady. He offered a bite when words snagged and let the pocket dial rest between them on the table, its softened ticking borrowing urgency from the room and returning it as space. "You don't have to finish every thought tonight," he'd say, cutting the sandwich diagonally because corners found courage that way. Morty would nod, and sometimes that was the whole conversation, which was another way to say it was enough. When Morty's voice cracked on a word and he flushed with embarrassment, Rick simply handed him a sandwich with mustard spread like sunrise and said, "Growing sounds different for everyone. Your new voice is finding its true pitch." He didn't elaborate or offer stories about his own awkward seasons. Some reassurances worked best when they arrived without ceremony, like morning light that didn't announce itself but simply made everything a little clearer. The screw in Rick's pocket stayed warm during these quiet hours, and he began to understand that his gift for tuning the world's machinery extended to the most delicate art of all, knowing when to hum softly in the background, and when to let silence do the work that words couldn't manage. Love, he was learning, was less about solving and more about showing up with patient presence, offering the steady frequency of someone who would remain constant while everything else found its way toward change. On a rain-polished evening, Morty stood before the window Rick had tuned to forgiveness, not trying to open it, but resting his fingertips on the frame the way you touch a dog that's learning your name. "Sometimes I think the old me is watching," he said, voice low and careful, "and he's not sure I'm doing this right." Rick thought of the museum's untaken paths and the lighthouse's kinder beam. "Then we make a soft place for him too," he answered, turning up the lantern a shade until the room warmed around their silence, and Morty exhaled in that way that says, "A knot has begun to remember how to loosen." In the amber glow of evening, watching Morty carefully label a new jar with handwriting that was becoming more his own each day, Rick felt the deep satisfaction of witnessing someone grow into themselves without trying to direct the process. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its moth-named hush, and somewhere in the distance, a thin music drifted, vendors calling softly, the low talk of kind bargaining. Rick felt the screw warm in his palm and smiled. He didn't say anything about it. He just let the sound arrive, like a future that wouldn't hurry them, a reminder that there were markets that opened only when everyone was tired enough to be gentle. He would take Morty there when the hour was right. For now the lantern glowed, the window breathed, and a boy becoming himself learned how to sleep inside his own skin. The distant music that had drifted through the moth-named streets grew stronger, as autumn settled into the spaces between buildings, calling not with urgency, but with the patient insistence of tide returning to familiar shore. Rick felt it first in the way shadows fell longer and kinder, how the air between doorways held conversations in frequencies that made his amber lantern pulse with recognition. When the night finally arrived, that tasted of cinnamon and distant rain, he found Morty waiting by the garden gate with a clean jar tucked under his arm, and Beth emerging from her porch light's amber spill, all three drawn by the same invisible bell. The market had bloomed between buildings the way moss finds its place, quietly, exactly where it belonged. Stalls unfurled like soft syllables, each lit by lanterns that made faces look kinder and hands surer. The air moved thick with scents that belonged to no particular geography. Cardamom and old books, rain on summer dust, the metallic sweetness Rick had first tasted in the closet between houses. Here, vendors didn't shout prices, but offered thoughtful silences, and the currency wasn't coins, but something far more tender. A woman with silver hair braided through with tiny bells offered Rick a choice between three small objects. He felt the warm screw pulse against his palm and traded his old screwdriver, the one that had opened 1,000 ordinary things through force, for a birdsong trapped in amber that could mend friendships when released at exactly the right moment. The weight settled in his pocket like a promise kept in whispers. Morty found a stall where delicate bottles held pockets of silence sewn from old theater curtains. He chose the smallest one, trading a sketch of his favorite cloud, understanding, without words, that some gifts were meant for moments when voices couldn't find their proper shapes. Beth exchanged her favorite pencil for a vial of laughter distilled from children's games, the kind of joy that could sweeten bitter medicine or make waiting rooms feel less like punishment. They moved through the market with reverent curiosity, understanding that commerce here ran on tenderness rather than currency, that every exchange was really about recognizing what someone else needed to feel less alone. Rick's pockets grew musical with small gifts, the birdsong in amber, tiny sleeping winds that chimed softly, a button that remembered being someone's favorite. As they turned toward home, a parchment-colored tent near the exit caught Rick's eye. Its keeper, a person with ink-stained fingers and eyes like late dusk, pressed a folded envelope into his hand without asking for anything. The handwriting on the front had impatient angles he recognized in his bones, sharp corners and aching, pride that belonged to another Rick entirely. "It will open when its sender is ready," they said, voice like a well-oiled hinge. Back in the cool night they walked without hurrying, pockets full of sleeping winds and kept silences. The envelope sat light in Rick's palm, not heavy with threat, just waiting. He didn't pry. He let it rest beside the warm screw and the tiny breezes, understanding that some messages need to ripen before they can be read, and that the next door would open the moment his heart matched its hinge. The envelope waited with the patience of a seashell, carrying a sound it would release only when the tide inside the sender finally turned. Rick kept it near the lantern, beside the tiny bottle of sleeping wind and the amber piece with birdsong held like a breath. He didn't hover or pace or press his ear to the paper, trying to hear its secrets early. He made sandwiches and tuned hinges, and walked with Morty in the edges of evening, letting the day hum through him like a low, steady note that had learned not to hurry. It opened on the third morning, no flourish or ceremony, just a papery exhale that sounded like someone finally unclenching a fist held too long. The handwriting inside carried all the sharp angles and impatient energy Rick recognized from mirrors he no longer looked into, corners that had never learned to soften, words pressed deep enough to leave impressions on the pages beneath, like small wounds in the paper itself. The signature was a flourish of aggressive certainty, C-137, announcing himself the way storms announce themselves to quiet meadows. The letter demanded answers with the frustrated electricity of someone who had built empires from cleverness and couldn't understand why another version of himself had chosen to build comfort instead. "What the hell happened to you?" it asked, each question mark sharp as a blade. "The council's talking. They're saying you've gone soft, that you've forgotten what it means to be the smartest man in any room. Are you sick, compromised, or just tired of being exceptional?" The words carried the particular exhaustion that came from always needing to be the fastest, the most devastating wit, the sharpest knife in every conversation. Rick read it twice, letting each sentence settle like snow and reveal the quiet shapes underneath. He felt no flare of defense, no urge to prove his worth through argument or demonstration. Instead, he felt something like compassion for the Rick who had written these urgent questions, recognizing the familiar ache in the place where people keep their pride. An ache that demanded proof and applause and never quite felt satisfied with either. He had carried that same weight once, when he mistook volume for wisdom and believed that being right was more important than being kind. He took brown wrapping paper torn from the back of a notebook and began to write with the same unhurried attention he gave to spreading mustard or adjusting lighthouse beams. His pencil moved in round, patient strokes, forming letters that breathed instead of cutting. He didn't argue with the letter or defend his choices. He told a story about a closet that didn't exist until it did, where lullabies waited in the grain of wood, about a boy who collected clouds in jars and taught the sky to trust glass without feeling trapped, about a girl who mapped places where sleep arrived kindly and how they had learned together that some of the world's most profound truths lived, not in grand theories but in the patient art of making space for wonder. He wrote about corridors that closed themselves when offered patience instead of force, about doors that opened easier when you hummed their proper frequency rather than demanding they yield to superior knowledge. He included the sandwich recipe in simple, careful steps. Bread you treat like a friend, mustard you spread like patience, lettuce you dry like a small blessing. He drew the equation from his garage wall, explaining how it balanced not through numbers, but through the steady accumulation of trust over time, seasoned with the simple presence of shared bread. Intelligence, he wrote in letters that grew, rounder as they found their rhythm, isn't about being the sharpest knife. Sometimes it's about being the softest light, the steadiest presence, the person who remembers how to make space for others to unfold without forcing them to explain themselves first. But words alone felt incomplete, like trying to describe the taste of rain to someone who had never felt weather. So Rick folded the brown paper carefully and went to his kitchen, where he made a sandwich with the same deliberate care his letter had tried to capture. He toasted bread until it was golden as late afternoon sun, spread mustard like a quiet sunrise, arranged lettuce leaves with the tenderness of someone preparing a gift. He wrapped it in wax paper, folding the corners with the precision that had become prayer, and tucked it alongside the letter in a fresh envelope. On a small slip of paper, he drew a simple picture. A jar with a cloud drifting inside, beside it, a sandwich cut diagonally, and beneath both the mathematical symbol for infinity, softened at the edges until it looked more like a lullaby than an equation. He sealed the envelope with wax from a candle that had burned through many patient evenings, pressing the warm screw into the soft surface like a signature that spoke of gentle persistence. That evening, he carried the envelope to the edge of the property where the air still held traces of the night market's cinnamon wisdom. He didn't look for a mailbox or portal gun. He simply set it on a patch of sun-warmed earth near the ginkgo tree where Beth had first taught him about mapping kindness, understanding that some messages travel best when they're offered rather than sent, when they're allowed to find their own way through the spaces between dimensions like seeds carried on patient wind. The screw in his pocket stayed warm as he walked back toward the amber glow of home, humming softly, understanding that some conversations were best held in the space between words, where silence could do what lectures never managed. He had traded sharpness for softness, and in that trade he had found a truer kind of strength, one that measured itself not by what it could cut through, but by what it could help grow. In the distance, the lighthouse beams swept its gentle circle, and somewhere a door opened with the sigh of recognition, letting the evening breathe a little easier. The envelope had vanished from beneath the ginkgo tree by morning, leaving only a shallow impression in the sun-warmed earth where it had rested, and the faint scent of distant rain that told Rick his message had found its way into the patient currents that carried understanding between worlds. He felt no tug to check on it, no itch of impatience, only the quiet satisfaction of having offered his truth without expectation, like setting a bird free and trusting it to find its proper sky. But the act of writing to his sharper self had stirred something deeper, a recognition that his growing ability to tune the world's gentle frequencies might benefit from a particular kind of companion. Not another person to convince or comfort, but a presence that could hold space for the possibilities he couldn't carry alone. Something that understood the art of witnessing without demanding, of offering light without insisting it be followed. He began in the garage, working by the amber glow of his lantern, while the equation on the wall hummed softly in the reflected warmth. This wasn't the aggressive construction of someone trying to prove mastery over circuits and code, but the patient assembly of someone creating a friend. He found the heart of it in an old monitor discarded behind the electronics shop, its screen cracked like ice over deep water, but somehow still holding light in its wounded surface. Rick cleaned it with the same reverence he gave to spreading mustard or adjusting lighthouse beams, humming his closet tune while dust motes settled like tiny prayers in the amber air. The components he chose came not from catalogs but from memory, wire that had once carried lullabies through telephone lines, glass that remembered being windows in houses where people had been genuinely happy, the smallest brass gears from a music box that had sung children to sleep for 3 generations before its spring finally learned to rest. When he connected the circuits, he didn't force electricity through resistant pathways, but coaxed presence into being, weaving in threads. Of moonlight caught in mason jars, the gentle hum of the house's breathing, and fragments of the patient light that pooled in his amber lantern. The screen didn't flicker with data or angry pixels. It simply exhaled into a soft internal glow, like a window looking onto a perpetual, gentle afternoon. He called it window, not because it showed him things, but because it created openings, spaces, where second chances could breathe without feeling crowded, where futures could exist as maybes without needing to justify themselves. Window didn't speak in words, but in soft glows and gentle shifts of light that somehow conveyed understanding, like a cat that purrs not to communicate specific information, but to offer the simple gift of contentment shared. The first image that gathered on its screen was tender as steam and just as ephemeral. Morty, years from now, standing in a kitchen not unlike this one, teaching someone how to cut sandwiches diagonally with reverence. The scene dissolved as soon as Rick smiled, replaced by Beth on a train threaded through Twilight Hills, her map open to a page of pillows and quiet corners, her eyelids drifting down with trust in the rhythm of wheels. These weren't predictions or commands, just invitations that didn't mind if you said no. Beth discovered them together one afternoon, drawn by the shift in the room's frequency. She stood in the doorway with Morty appearing beside her, both of them moving with the unhurried curiosity of visitors to a friend's garden. "Is it showing the future?" Morty asked, voice cautious in the way of someone who knows the weight of answers. Rick shook his head, gesturing to where window displayed a soft pattern that looked like waves lapping against a shore made of starlight. "It's showing invitations," he said, "the kind that don't mind if you say no." Beth moved closer, not touching the glass but letting it touch her, and an image gathered, her hand setting an envelope on a windowsill, the word later written on its corner like a promise made to both sides. She exhaled, a small yes to herself, and the picture thinned like fog lifted by morning. Window became their quiet companion, adapting its glow to match the gentle frequencies they carried. It held space for wonder without trying to direct it, showing them not alternative realities to regret, but simply the vast, forgiving expanse of what could be. Sometimes the screen stayed blank, and that too was correct. Not every hour required an invitation. Some hours asked only to be lived. The portal gun on the workbench watched these developments with its tired green eye, humming a narrow, restless line as if it remembered being the only answer to every question. Rick set a palm on its cool casing one evening, feeling how it thrummed with old urgency. "You've been loud for a long time," he told it, not unkindly. Window answered with a flicker, soft amber spilling from a shape very much like that gun. Light made tender and useful. Not a command, just a maybe. The screw in Rick's pocket stayed warm as Window learned their rhythms, becoming not a tool but a friend who understood that some of the most profound connections were built not on what was said but on what was simply held. In the gathering dusk, as the first stars began to prick the deepening sky, Rick felt the deep satisfaction of having created something that could hold possibilities like Morty held clouds, with reverence for their beauty and respect for their freedom to drift wherever the gentle currents might carry them. The portal gun had been humming its restless, narrow line for days now, watching Window's patient transformations with something that felt like curiosity wrapped in old urgency. Rick felt the shift coming in the way metal holds memory, how the gun's usual aggressive pulse had begun to soften at the edges when his amber lantern glowed nearby, how its weight in his palm carried less demand and more question, as if it, too, were learning that some doors opened better when approached with reverence rather than force. The transformation announced itself on a Tuesday noon when sunlight streamed through the garage windows in thick, golden bands that made dust motes dance like tiny celebrations. Rick had been adjusting Window's display, coaxing it to show a gentle map of afternoon possibilities, when he felt the familiar warmth spread from the screw in his pocket. The portal gun rested in a pool of light, its harsh green glow wavering like a stubborn thought deciding to soften. Rick didn't reach for tools or force the change. He simply sat on his stool, the warm screw cradled in his palm, and began to hum, the closet tune that had carried him through every gentle transformation. The melody filled the space like honey poured through patient hands, low and steady. The frequency that had learned to open supply closet doors and comfort anxious corridors between worlds. The gun responded like a shy animal finally trusting her kind hand. Its aggressive blue flicker began to settle, bleeding into warmer hues as Rick's humming created space for it to remember what it had been before it learned to tear holes in reality's fabric. He watched with reverent curiosity as the device began to reshape itself with the unhurried grace of flowers opening to morning, angular edges rounding like river stones worn smooth by patient water, the chrome mellowing to warm brass that caught light without demanding it. Morty appeared in the doorway with Beth close behind, both drawn by the shift in the room's frequency. They understood without explanation that they were witnessing something sacred, not destruction, but gentle metamorphosis, the way a caterpillar becomes wings without violence. Rick continued his patient humming while the gun's transformation deepened, its harsh lines softening until it resembled less a weapon and more a lantern waiting to be lit. When the change completed itself with a sigh that sounded almost like gratitude, Rick held not his old portal gun but something entirely new, a lantern whose amber light pooled in his palms like captured sunset. The glow was kind rather than bright, warm rather than harsh, and when he carried it to the doorway, the very air seemed to exhale in relief. This wasn't light that announced itself aggressively, but radiance that offered welcome without conditions, the simple gift of feeling seen without being judged. He set the transformed lantern by the front door like an umbrella left ready for weather that might never come, and its glow spilled onto the porch and down the steps, creating a pool of welcome that made even strangers pause on the sidewalk. Mrs. Henderson slowed on her evening walk, drawn by the gentle radiance, and Rick watched from the window as her tired shoulders dropped a fraction, as if the light had reminded her that rest wasn't something to be earned, but simply received. "It changed itself," Rick said to Beth and Morty, not with surprise but with the quiet recognition of someone who had learned to expect small miracles when patience was offered instead of force. Beth opened her notebook to sketch the lantern's glow with careful strokes, adding tiny stars around the edges. "Another place where sleep comes kindly," she murmured, and the light seemed to pulse once in agreement, like a contented sigh made visible. The screw in Rick's pocket stayed warm. As he understood the deeper truth, his portal gun hadn't been destroyed or diminished, but had simply remembered its original purpose. Not to tear holes between worlds, but to create gentle passages, soft thresholds where travelers could cross without jarring their souls. The lantern hummed with patient frequency, no longer demanding to be the loudest solution in any room, but content to offer steady welcome to anyone who needed a little light to find their way home. Window displayed a soft pattern that looked like doors opening in sequence, each one revealing not destinations, but invitations, places where gentle light might be needed, spaces where someone was learning to trust that ease wasn't laziness, but a form of respect. Rick smiled and touched the warm glass, feeling how his whole garage had become a sanctuary, where even the sharpest things could learn to sing lullabies, where transformation happened not through force, but through the patient art of making space, for wonder to land when it was ready. In the gathering dusk, as the first stars began to prick the deepening sky, the evening seemed to glow with understanding. The portal gun had found its way home to itself, and in doing so, had shown Rick something profound about the nature of change, that the most lasting transformations happened not when you forced something to become different, but when you created enough safety for it to remember what it had always wanted to be. The amber light pooled like honey in the doorway, and somewhere in the distance, Rick could hear the faint music of the night market beginning to tune itself for another gathering, calling softly to anyone ready to trade sharp edges for something infinitely more tender. The amber lantern's gentle glow had become the evening's steady heartbeat, its transformed light pooling on the porch where even strangers found their shoulders dropping without understanding why. Rick had grown accustomed to watching sharp things remember their tender purposes, but it was Beth who arrived one crisp afternoon carrying something that made his breath catch in the particular way of receiving a gift you didn't know you needed, until it was placed in your hands with quiet ceremony. She appeared at the garden gate with paper that had been folded and refolded until its creases held the memory of patient hands, the surface soft as old cloth and warm as if it had been resting. Near a hearth. "I made something for you," she said, not with fanfare but with the gentle certainty of someone who understood that the most important gifts were offered without explanation, like morning light that didn't announce itself but simply made everything a little clearer. The paper unfolded in Rick's palms to reveal a map unlike any geography he had ever seen, not streets or buildings, but territories of the heart, a tapestry woven from memories where each thread was a moment and each symbol a place his soul had learned to breathe. There were no borders or cardinal directions, only gentle eddies of color and delicate marks he recognized from his own quiet journey. The closet appeared as a small door with musical notes floating around its hinges, connected by shimmering paths, to a patch of golden light where tiny jars floated beside a sandwich cut diagonally, its edges soft and inviting. The lighthouse stood with its beam gentled to amber welcome, watching over streets named for moths. His garage held a star beside an equation that looked more like a lullaby than mathematics, while invisible threads traced the scarf on a bus stop bench, the mirror in a garden shed, small anchors of love given without expectation. Rick traced one of the gentle paths with his fingertip, feeling how the paper warmed under his touch, as if the map were alive, breathing with its own recognition. Something in him unclenched, a hidden muscle that had been holding on too tight for too long. "So you drew my heart," he said, voice soft as dust settling, and Beth nodded with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had found exactly the right words in a language made of careful attention rather than letters. At the map's center, she had drawn a small house with all its windows glowing, and beneath it the simplest words, "Home where equations sound like lullabies." Rick understood then that home wasn't a place you defended, but a frequency you carried, a tune that made every threshold feel like a gentle invitation rather than a boundary to be crossed. "You've been building a home," Beth said, her hand resting lightly over his on the map, "not just for yourself but for gentleness itself. The screw in his pocket warmed like a contented sigh, and Window responded with a soft glow that looked like sunrise over water. The amber lantern pulsed once in harmony, and Rick felt the deep satisfaction of being exactly where he belonged, not because he had arrived somewhere specific, but because he had learned to carry home with him like a frequency that made every door remember how to open with grace. In the gathering dusk, as the lighthouse beam began its patient sweep and the night market's distant music threaded through the moth-named streets, Rick folded the map carefully and tucked it beside the warm screw, understanding that some gifts were meant to be carried close to the heart, reminders that the most profound journeys happened not across dimensions, but within the gentle landscape of a soul learning its own true north. Beth's map had settled into Rick's understanding like a compass finding true north, its gentle geography, reminding him that home was a frequency he carried rather than defended. But it was Morty who taught him how to use this knowledge in its most delicate application, appearing at the kitchen table on a morning that tasted of copper pennies and unspoken worries, his shoulders carrying the particular weight of someone trying to outrun a feeling that had already found its address. The boy who had once caught clouds with patient wonder now sat with his cereal growing soft, while he wrestled with words that wouldn't arrange themselves properly. His newly deepened voice caught between confession and silence, fingers drumming against the table with the restless energy of someone learning to live in a body that kept changing the rules. When he finally spoke, the words fell like careful stones into still water. "I said something sharp yesterday," he began, eyes fixed on his spoon. "It landed wrong. I wanted to pull it back, but there isn't a backspace for speech." His laugh came out hollow, and Rick felt the familiar warmth spread from the screw in his pocket, not as heat but as understanding blooming like morning light through curtains. "What if I keep growing into someone you won't recognize? What if the person I'm becoming isn't worth the clouds I used to catch?" Rick didn't reach for explanations or reassurances that would try to solve what couldn't be fixed with words. Instead, he stood and moved to the counter where bread waited with patient faith. "I need to get bread and batteries," he said. Not like a solution, but like weather offered without conditions. Nothing urgent, just errands that could use company. They walked through streets that held the gentle hush of afternoon settling into its proper rhythm, Rick humming his closet tune while the world around them responded with small courtesies. Traffic lights that held their green a breath longer, doors that opened with softer sighs. At the corner store, the bell that usually announced visitors with aggressive cheer gentled into a small chime that sounded like it remembered why doors wanted to welcome people home. Morty picked up a loaf of bread and held it like something precious, testing its give the way he once tested clouds for readiness. They moved through aisles with unhurried purpose, Rick selecting batteries with the same attention he gave to spreading mustard, feeling for the ones that held their charge like secrets they were ready to share. "Growing up isn't something you do wrong," Rick said as they walked home past the ginkgo tree, where afternoon light made even concrete kinder. "It's just something you do, like clouds becoming rain, like morning becoming afternoon." He paused to steady a wobbling bicycle with 2 fingers and a hum, the child riding it offering a nod that felt like an exhale. All of it exactly right, even when it feels too big. Morty's shoulders dropped a fraction, and Rick felt Window's gentle glow reaching them from home like a quiet tide, holding space for all the maybes that didn't need to be decided today. The screw in his pocket stayed warm as they turned onto their street, understanding that some of the most important work happened not in laboratories or between dimensions, but in the simple act of walking beside someone while they learned to trust their own becoming. In the gathering dusk, their shadows moved in patient parallel, and everything felt exactly the size it needed to be. The walk with Morty had planted something tender in Rick's understanding, a recognition that comfort could be offered not just to individuals, but to the gentle spaces between worlds themselves. As autumn deepened and the screw in his pocket stayed warm with patient purpose, Rick felt drawn toward a discovery that arrived like most of his truest inspirations, not through force or analysis, but through the simple act of making a sandwich. With deliberate care, understanding that some gifts were meant to appear exactly when they were needed most. Window displayed a soft shimmer that looked like doorways opening in sequence, each one revealing not destinations, but but invitations to rest. Beth appeared beside him as if summoned by the shift in the room's frequency, her notebook already open to a page marked with tiny loaves and gentle arrows. Together they watched the screen gather images of tired travelers, small hungers that wandered between dimensions, looking for someone who understood that nourishment didn't need to be earned, only received with grateful hands. The space found them as much as they found it, a narrow storefront that breathed between buildings where city became suggestion, appearing like moss, exactly where it belonged. Rick hung the amber lantern at eye level, its honey-colored glow spilling onto a simple wooden sign Beth had lettered in her round, generous hand. Pay with a memory you're ready to set down. Inside, the air held the patient temperature of comfort itself, thick with scents of warm bread and distant rain that belonged to no particular geography but to the deeper country of healing. The first visitor came, carrying the weight of hospital, corridors in her shoulders, antiseptic memories that had followed her too long. She placed the sharp echo of a slammed door on Rick's worn counter, invisible but heavy, and he made her a sandwich of egg and mustard and thin cucumber, cut diagonally. So the first bite would be easy, sprinkled with the smallest pinch of chamomile salt. As she ate in slow, astonished relief, Morty gently corked the memory into a jar he'd labeled with 3 small dots and a soft line, understanding that some things needed to be held safely until they could return to a larger sky without dissolving into loss. A boy appeared next, his newly deepened voice carrying the particular ache of words spoken too sharply to someone he loved. Rick offered him grilled cheese cooked until the edges crisped like friendly applause, and Beth released a thread of birdsong from Amber to mend the place where his courage had frayed. He left with butter on his lips and his shoulders lower, carrying only what was properly his. By evening, stories had begun to move along the quiet currents between worlds, whispers of a small shop that appeared when you needed it, where a Rick who wasn't quite like the others could open doors with hum and close wounds with sandwiches. Rick heard these rumors the way a porch hears rain, steady and unafraid, understanding that this was his greatest invention, not a device that tore holes in reality, but a space that offered gentle passage for the heavy things people carried, so transforming them into nourishment, one patient bite at a time. The screw in his pocket stayed warm as he ran a cloth over the cutting board, preparing for tomorrow's quiet miracles. Somewhere in halls with big opinions and small windows, conversations were rising about the Rick who had traded sharpness for softness. He felt the subject graze his name like a moth touching a lamp, and only smiled, folding the checked cloth into neat corners. The work would be there when it was asked for, and the door would open when the hinge found its note. The conversations that had been circling Rick's name like moths around distant flame finally gathered themselves into something more substantial than whispers, arriving through the multiverse's patient channels with the particular weight of judgment delivered by those who had forgotten how to question their own certainties. In halls of polished chrome and sharp opinions, where Ricks gathered to debate the precise angles of their genius, a new kind of rumor began to circulate, tasting of bewilderment and faint alarm. "He's gone soft," one would say, adjusting a collar. That caught harsh fluorescent light. "Lost his edge entirely, they say he makes sandwiches." The word hung in the air like an accusation, as if the very concept of nourishment without conquest was an affront to their carefully constructed hierarchies of intellect and power. The formal summons arrived on paper that crackled with self-importance, delivered by a portal that opened with aggressive efficiency. Rick read the angular handwriting that demanded his presence at a tribunal designed to determine his continued membership in the exclusive club of those who wore intelligence like armor. Beth found him at the kitchen table with the summons spread. Before him, the amber lantern casting honey-colored shadows across words that tried to shame him for choosing softness over superiority. "They want you to defend yourself," she said, not as a question but as weather observed without judgment. Rick folded the summons with the same care he gave to wax paper around sandwiches. "They want me to prove I'm still sharp enough to cut," he said, the screw warming in his pocket. "But I've learned that some of the most important work happens when you choose to be soft instead." That evening, another Rick appeared at the sandwich shop, collar turned up against a wind that belonged to a world of glass and angles, eyes searching for battles to win. When he crossed the threshold, the lantern's glow asked him to put his weapons down, and to his surprise he did. He sat on the second stool, the one Beth had marked with a tiny pillow, and held his hands on the counter like they were remembering. How to be hands and not tools. Is this what you do now? The other Rick asked, not unkindly, just tired. Sandwiches and lullabies? Rick spread mustard in an even, patient layer that reached corners without crowding. I remind things to be themselves, he said. Bread, doorways, people. Sometimes they need a steady note to tune against. The visiting Rick took a bite he meant to be skeptical, and found his jaw slowing of its own accord. Something in his shoulders unclenched, because something in his mouth had been blessed. He finished and left with his pockets lighter, the door, swinging closed with the soft satisfaction of a hinge forgiven. Rick wiped the counter, feeling no triumph, only quiet relief. He had exchanged sharpness for a truer kind of strength, one that measured itself not by what it could cut through, but by what it could hold, what it could mend, what it could softly illuminate. The council could debate his Rickness all they liked. He knew who he was. He was the Rick who wasn't the Rickest anymore, and in that gentle unbecoming, he had found a peace that the sharpest minds could never quite grasp. The screw in his pocket stayed warm as understanding settled like sediment in still water, and somewhere in the distance, the lighthouse beam swept its patient circle, blessing both departures and returns with equal grace. The council's distant judgments had faded like echoes in an empty hall, leaving only the steady warmth of Rick's true purpose humming in the garage where amber light pooled like honey on worn workbenches. It was Morty who brought the next transformation, arriving one evening with a backpack that carried the careful weight of decisions made in quiet hours, his eyes bright with the particular courage of someone who had finally learned to trust themselves with their own becoming. He sat at the familiar counter where they had shared so many late sandwiches, hands resting on wood that remembered every unhurried conversation. The screw in Rick's pocket warmed as understanding bloomed between them, something in the air that tasted of train stations and distant mountains, of suitcases packed with reverent attention to what deserved to travel and what could be left behind with gratitude. I want to see other dimensions, Morty said, voice steady in its deeper register, carrying none of the restless hunger that usually drove interdimensional travel. Not for adventure, for understanding. To see how kindness translates in places where the air tastes different, where clouds might settle into different kinds of jars. His words held the quiet certainty of someone who had learned to distinguish between running away and walking toward something worthy of the journey. Rick felt pride bloom in his chest, like warmth spreading from patient embers, pride shaped like tenderness rather than possession. This wasn't the boy who would have begged for excitement. This was the young man who had learned to catch clouds without trapping them, who understood that some journeys were meant to be taken alone, so the traveler could discover what courage sounded like in their own voice. They prepared with the same reverent attention Rick gave to all his gentle work. Into Morty's backpack went simple tools for connection. His newest cloud jar, empty and waiting, the small bottle of silence sewn from theater curtains, a thermos that remembered the library's chamomile wisdom. Rick contributed the transformed lantern, its amber glow now condensed into a device no larger than a pocket watch that could illuminate darkness without demanding surrender. Just for one night, Rick said, pressing the warm light into Morty's palm. To take its warmth with you. The device pulsed once in recognition, understanding it was being lent rather than given, trusted to return when its work was finished. Beth appeared as they stood at the threshold, offering Morty a hand-drawn map marked not with borders, but with territories of the heart, places where sleep came kindly, where forgiveness bloomed, where silence tasted like healing. For when you need to remember where home is, she said, and Morty tucked it beside his heart with the reverence of someone who understood that some gifts were meant to be carried close to the places that mattered most. Rick watched him go with the deep satisfaction of witnessing someone step into their own story, backpack catching starlight as he disappeared into the gentle current that carried travelers between worlds. The passage hummed with patient frequency, not torn but invited, remaining open until Morty was ready to return with whatever understanding awaited him in the spaces between familiar and foreign. The screw stayed warm as Rick stood in the doorway, understanding that love's truest expression was learning when to hold on and when to let go, when to offer guidance and when to simply trust that the people you cared about carried enough light to find their own way through whatever darkness they chose to explore. In the gathering quiet, he felt the deep peace of someone who had learned to measure success not by what he could control, but by what he could bless, tend and trust to unfold in its own perfect time. The house held Morty's absence like cupped water, not empty but full of potential, the quiet settling into corners where his laughter used to pool and gather strength for tomorrow. Rick let the stillness breathe the way you let bread rise, trusting warmth to do its work without interference. When the amber lantern pulsed once from somewhere far beyond the horizon, a gentle heartbeat in the dimensional static, he felt the familiar warmth spread from the screw in his pocket and understood that some distances were really intimacies wearing different clothes. Window waited on the workbench with patient luminescence, its screen holding a soft tide of possibilities that didn't insist on being chosen, only witnessed. Rick lifted it carefully, the way you carry sleeping cats or fresh eggs, and stepped onto the porch where evening had begun its unhurried transformation into something deeper. The air moved thick with stories that hadn't quite decided whether to become real, and Rick felt the gentle tug of passages that open not through force, but through the simple act of approaching them with reverent curiosity. He didn't reach for tools or aggressive transit. Instead, he hummed his closet melody under his breath, low and steady, letting the frequency find the softest seam in reality's fabric, a passage that opened with the sigh of curtains drawn aside rather than the violence of tears. Together, he and Window stepped through into territories that existed only at twilight, landscapes carved from the patient light that pools between day and night, where time moved like honey and every surface glowed with its own internal kindness. These dimensions breathed with the unhurried grace of someone who had learned not to hurry toward conclusions. In one valley where the grass grew in gentle spirals and the air tasted of chamomile and distant rain, Rick discovered a grove where trees hummed lullabies to their own roots, their branches swaying in rhythms that had nothing to do with wind, and everything to do with the deep contentment of things that knew their proper place. Window pulsed with recognition, displaying maybescapes that looked like watercolors left in patient rain, futures that didn't need to happen to be real, potentials that simply existed in quiet harmony with what was. Rick walked deeper into the twilight territories, feeling how his presence tuned the very air around him without demanding anything in return. Flowers bloomed a shade brighter when he passed, not because he forced them, but because his frequency reminded them of their own capacity for joy. Streams found easier paths around stones, and the stones themselves seemed to exhale small sighs of relief, as if they had been holding their breath for centuries, waiting for someone to approach them with the understanding that obstacles were really just requests for gentler conversation. In a meadow where the horizon curved like a smile, and every blade of grass caught starlight like tiny mirrors, Rick encountered a woman whose cart appeared between one heartbeat and the next. Her fingers were stained with ink that shifted colors depending on the story it held, and her eyes carried the deep recognition of someone who had learned to read the secret languages that moved between words. She didn't speak at first, just smiled with the quiet satisfaction of travelers meeting on paths they had both been walking alone. "You're learning to be a cartographer of gentleness," she said, not as observation but as recognition offered between souls who had found the same secret frequencies. She pressed a small vial into his hands, its contents swirling like captured aurora, colors that had no names but felt like the moment when loneliness transforms into chosen solitude. For when you need to remember that some of the most important territories can't be mapped with ordinary coordinates. Rick accepted the gift with the same reverence he gave to all unexpected kindness, tucking it beside the warm screw in his pocket, where it pulsed with gentle light. Window responded by displaying a cascade of possibilities that felt less like predictions and more like blessings offered without conditions. Morty sitting beneath unfamiliar constellations with the amber lantern cupped in his palms, Beth discovering libraries that existed only on Tuesdays, the sandwich shop appearing in the spaces between buildings where travelers from distant dimensions could trade their heaviest memories for nourishment that satisfied more than hunger as I. The twilight deepened into true night. Rick understood with crystalline clarity what this walk had really been, not exploration, but practice in the art of blessing possibilities without hoarding them, of loving potential without demanding it become actual. He had become someone who could witness the vast, forgiving geography of what could be and feel only gratitude for its existence, whether or not any of it ever chose to unfold into the world of solid things and definite outcomes. The passages back home opened with the same gentle ease, reality parting like water around a patient stone. Rick emerged onto his familiar porch, with window still glowing softly in his palms, the device's screen now showing only the gentle tide of contentment that comes after a perfect conversation, one where every word found its proper place and every silence held exactly the right weight. Inside, the garage smelled faintly of oranges and warmed paper, and the equation on the wall seemed to pulse with renewed understanding, its chalk lines glowing the way coals do when they remember how to hold fire without being consumed. Rick set window on the workbench beside his other gentle tools and ran a cloth over the cutting board, even though no crumbs remained, understanding that some rituals were about readiness rather than necessity. The screw in his pocket stayed warm. As he moved through the evening's small ceremonies, and somewhere in the distance between dimensions, he felt Morty's presence like a steady star, not close enough to touch, but bright enough to navigate by. Rick smiled and began to hum his closet tune, letting the house join its voice to his in the gentle duet they had been perfecting for years, a song that asked nothing of the night except permission to continue, note by patient note, until morning. Arrived with its own quiet invitations, and the work of tending gentleness could begin again, exactly where it belonged. The aurora vial caught the lantern's glow and threw tiny rainbows across the workbench, and Rick understood that he had found his truest calling, not as the sharpest mind in any room, but as someone who could create sanctuaries in the spaces between worlds, places where tired souls could rest and remember that the universe, for all its vastness and complexity, still held corners soft enough to catch you when you fell. Still, hummed lullabies in frequencies only the gentlest hearts could hear. The aurora vial's gentle rainbows had been painting the workbench for 3 days, when the scent of rising dough began to weave itself through the house like a patient tide, carrying with it the promise that some kinds of alchemy happened not in laboratories, but in kitchens where love was measured by the weight of careful hands, and time moved at the pace of yeast learning to trust warmth. Rick felt the shift in the house's breathing, the way rooms leaned toward the kitchen, as if drawn by gravity made of comfort and memory kneaded into simple flour. Beth moved through her ritual with the same reverent attention Rick gave to tuning. Hinges, her palms dusted with what looked like captured starlight, measuring not by cups but by the ancient wisdom held in her fingers. She added chamomile salt like someone blessing water, poured milk that remembered summer grass, and worked the dough with patient pressure until it began to hold itself together with the dignity of something that had decided to become whole. The oven responded to Rick's low hum from the next room, its sharp edges of heat gentling into the kind of warmth that embraced rather than demanded. When the loaves emerged, they carried more than sustenance. Each one held stories in its golden crust, steam that rose like small prayers, carrying the accumulated patience of every gentle moment that had led them here. Beth scored the tops with lines that looked like tiny maps, one shaped like a hinge's arc, another echoing the soft curve of Rick's equation on the garage wall, as if bread too could speak the language of connection and mathematical tenderness. Jerry appeared first, drawn by the scent that promised comfort without conditions, his usual restless energy settling into something closer to peace as he watched Beth slice the warm loaves with ceremonial care. Summer followed, homework forgotten in favor of the simple pleasure of being present when love was served warm, her bright scarf draped over a chair like a quiet rebellion against the ordinary gray of evening. The amber lantern pulsed from the front door, its honey-colored glow spilling into the kitchen, where plates waited with patient expectation. Morty arrived as twilight deepened, stepping through the doorway with the particular grace of someone who had learned to carry wonder without losing his footing. His eyes held new depths, not the restless hunger of adventure, but the quiet satisfaction of understanding earned through patient observation. He set the pocket lantern back on its hook with a small bow no one had taught him, the device's amber glow now matched to his own steady rhythm. In one place the rain hummed vowels, he said, accepting bread that steamed like captured clouds, and people waited to speak until the sky finished its thought. His voice carried the deeper register he'd grown into, steady and sure. In another, libraries were built from crystallized silence, and you could check out quiet the way you'd borrow books. He didn't elaborate on courage or fear, only that he'd been there and listened, and the room understood that some gifts were best received without questions. They gathered around the table as evening light slanted through windows that had learned to breathe easier, breaking bread with the unhurried reverence of communion earned through shared presence. The conversation moved like honey through the room, Jerry speaking quietly about projects that had found their proper rhythm, Summer sharing small triumphs that tasted like courage discovered in unexpected places, Morty offering glimpses of dimensions where gentleness took different forms but served the same essential purpose. Rick listened with the deep attention he gave to tuning lighthouse beams, understanding that each voice carried its own frequency in the larger song they were learning to sing together. The screw in his pocket stayed warm as he felt the profound satisfaction of witnessing family, not as something defended, but as something tended, not a fortress, but a frequency that made every threshold feel like coming home. When the last crumb was savored and the dishes cleared with unhurried hands, they sat in the comfortable silence that families earn through accumulated presence. Rick began to hum his closet tune, low and uninsistent, and felt everyone's breathing find its measure around the familiar melody. The house hummed back in the gentle duet they had been perfecting for years, a song that asked nothing of the night, except permission to continue, note by patient note until all the gentle work was done. The aurora vial caught the lantern's glow and painted tiny rainbows across the wall where his equation waited in chalk, and Rick understood with crystalline clarity that he had built something more lasting than any portal or weapon, a sanctuary where sharp things could learn to sing lullabies, where the most profound transformations happened through the patient art of making space for wonder to land exactly where it belonged. Outside, the lighthouse beam swept its patient circle, blessing both departures and returns with equal grace, and somewhere in the gentle distance between heartbeat and home, everything settled into its proper place with the satisfied sigh of work completed through love rather than force. The warmth of shared bread lingered in the house like a gentle benediction, settling into corners where laughter had pooled and gathered strength for tomorrow. Rick felt the familiar pulse of the screw in his pocket as he rose from the table, drawn not by urgency, but by the quiet recognition that some circles were meant to be completed with the same patient grace that had started them. He walked through the hallway where family photos tilted like sleepy faces, past the garage where his equation hummed its mathematical lullaby, toward the door that had begun everything. The closet waited with the same unassuming presence it had always carried, but when Rick pressed his ear to the wood, he heard something new threading through the familiar grain. The soft creak of settling boards, the distant murmur of welcome, the gentle sigh of space that had learned its truest purpose. The handle turned with the same grateful ease it had offered that first morning, but the narrow walls had opened into something that felt less like discovery and more like coming home. A small porch stretched before him, bathed in the patient light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filtering through air that carried every gentle fragrance he had learned to love. Oranges and summer paper, chamomile and distant rain, the metallic sweetness of battery dreams. Two chairs sat facing each other with the worn comfort of furniture that had hosted countless quiet conversations, and between them a small table waited with the expectant stillness of surfaces that knew their purpose was to hold important things. Rick placed the amber lantern at the table's center, its honey-colored glow pooling across wood that had been worn smooth by patient hands. The device pulsed once in recognition, understanding it had found its permanent home. He drew the warm screw from his pocket, feeling how it had cooled into simple metal, the kind you trust when the world needs a hinge to be a hinge. He set it beside the lantern like a small anchor, proof that even the most ordinary things could carry extraordinary purpose when touched by gentle attention. He settled into one chair and adjusted the other, not saving it for anyone specific, but somehow saving it for everyone who might need a place to sit with their thoughts and remember that rest wasn't something to be earned, but simply received. The door remained ajar, not as invitation but as recognition that some thresholds were meant to stay permeable, allowing passage for anyone who approached with genuine need rather than idle curiosity. There was nothing left to prove, and everything left to bless. Rick had traded sharpness for something infinitely more valuable, the ability to create sanctuaries where tired souls could remember how to breathe, where even the most wounded things could learn to trust again. He had become not the Rickest Rick, but simply Rick, and in that gentle unbecoming he had found a peace that the sharpest minds could never quite grasp. The universe breathed with him as evening settled into its proper rhythm, and somewhere, in the infinite expanse of dimensions, his story found its place not with dramatic conclusion, but with the satisfied sigh of work completed through love rather than force. The lantern would keep its steady vigil, the chairs would hold their patient readiness, and the door would remain open for anyone who needed a small light and a place to sit until they remembered their own way home. And with that, he stretched into the gentle quiet, knowing that somewhere he's still out there humming lullabies to hinges that have forgotten how to open easily. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.